Hi, today let's learn about data science. My name is Yolanda Gil from the Department of Computer Science and the Information Sciences Institute at the University of Southern California. What is data science? That's the first part of our adventure today. Data is everywhere. It surrounds us. It's completely and continuously collected from us and from our environment. It allows companies and governments to find out our activities, our behaviors. It allows us to get really personalized entertainment. It enables us to automate a lot of things in our world. It improves our health, and it helps with scientific discoveries. Data is everywhere around us. So this has caused quite a revolution. There's a lot of phenomena that could not be studied before that are available to us now. I want to put you in the shoes of people that deal with data and their challenges that they face and why technology and interactions are very important in data science. So this is a kid who is connected to a lot of monitors in an intensive care unit, an ICU. And these monitors are collecting a lot of data about them. But of course, this kid is ill. Their readings, their health readings are not within normal ranges. But there's some signals and some patterns that might help doctors detect if this kid is going into a period of concern, or if they are getting, in this example, some kind of respiratory disease. This is based in a real case that I worked with. So the doctors want to find this out. As you see on the top left, the doctors have all the domain knowledge. They understand that the temperature ranges may be off for a patient in these circumstances. They may have a really great understanding of the respiratory disease that they're trying to find patterns for, but not quite. That's why they want to look at this data. But for that, they need someone that can really extract patterns from the data. They need someone, as you see on the top right, that has expertise in machine learning, statistics, and can extract those patterns. But there's a wall, there's a barrier between them. They don't speak the same language. They don't understand each other very well. The questions that the doctor has have to be translated into some kind of metric, some kind of goal for the learning, the pattern extraction that is to happen. So there's a wall in between them. Now, the machine learning is not the only expertise required here. The data may be in part collected by nurses, in part collected by the doctors, in part collected by the hospital, in part in the patient record from before they came to the hospital. And so you need someone, as you see in the lower left, who is an expert in distributed data systems and understands how to pull all this data together. And finally, the doctor may have access to data from thousands of patients and maybe also patients nationwide or worldwide from many different organizations and hospitals. And so you need to be able to process this data very efficiently, maybe in the cloud, maybe parallelizing computations to make them more efficient. So you need yet another expert in these aspects. And it's very challenging to solve a problem. It takes a long time to break these walls and make the communication more fluid. The doctor gets shown some results. They may have some tweaks to make, and those tweaks also take time. So this is a very slow kind of collaboration. So data science gives us techniques and methodology to break those barriers and to see that if you have different expertise related to data, you can work together to solve very data-rich problems. And so that's the challenge and the novelty of data science, that we need to break those barriers. I want to spend some time thinking about the different types of data, because every type of data requires a different kind of analysis. So we're very used to tabular data, numerical data, spreadsheets of data. And one of the things that's become very much the norm is that if you had very small amount of data, it's easy to keep it clean and tidy and accurate. But these days we have data that is collected through websites, joined across different parts of the organization. And so it has, for example, errors. So you can see in the last row here, it's the semester is spring of the year 21-15, which is clearly an error. There's also a lot of different ways to say the same thing in the data. So there's not very standardized or normalized. So you can see that whether the course in this example is open could be yes, could be a Y, or you could say open. And sometimes the data might be missing, so you may not know whether it was open or not. So even tabular data, when you collect it at very large scales, it starts presenting new challenges that we did not see before. In the era of data science, text is also considered data, and we can analyze it and extract interesting patterns. So this is an example from a health domain. And so there's data to be obtained from all of these narratives that the doctors entered, but you have to kind of extract it. So if you needed to know when the disease started, or when a certain symptom started, or whether or not the patient has X or Y as a yes or no answer, you may have to do some text processing to extract that information. So text data, of course, it's ubiquitous on the web, and it gives us a lot of different possibilities for getting information about the world, and it's a very rich source of information. Data can also come in different multimedia platforms. So it can be pictures that we can process. We can try to extract the boundaries, the borders of different objects in the image, and then map them to types of objects in the world. So in that lower left example, can we see a building? Can we see people? Can we distinguish the ground? Can we see obstacles? So robots have to do with these kinds of processing of data constantly. There can be a lot of other sensors that you can merge the information from. For example, a sonar that tells you if there's an obstacle close by, even though you may not know what kind of obstacle it is. It may be the building itself or a person. There's also image data. I have an example here from a 3D image of a brain. It enables us to understand in different ways, not just things that humans see, but things that humans do not see. And so we can study different things, the brain, aquifers that are underground, and a lot of other kinds of information through image data. And then finally, on the right, I have an example of a video. This is an example that we collected from the internet, videos that showed groups of people getting together and then dispersing. And so we found a lot of interesting patterns of behavior. For example, people gathering in the corner of a street and then separating again. In this case, it's synchronized swimming. So all the swimmers come together and then disperse, come apart, and then come together again. So understanding behaviors, patterns, groups of people, and events that are happening in a video is a very interesting way to analyze data and to learn from data. So multimedia data has its own challenges and its own algorithms. Geospatial data used to come from well-known organizations, companies, governments that had curated very carefully, made the data very accurate and precise. Today, we have a lot of geospatial data that is extremely valuable, that is collected through volunteers or through crowdsourcing. So I have an example here of a disaster situation where people that are on the ground and have eyes on a bridge and can say if the bridge is functional or broken, or if there's a shelter, or if there's people gathered in a certain place. So these maps and these geospatial information are becoming more and more useful because they have very accurate information, in fact. And so they're no longer carefully precise quality maps. They may contain errors, and we have to learn to use it. We also have to learn to raise our confidence on the quality of the data if there's many different sources, different human witnesses, for example, that are reporting the same exact thing. So geospatial data has also changed a lot, and we have different ways to understand it and process it. Network data, of course, we have social media data. We understand when many people are connected. We like to understand how the information is disseminated throughout these networks. But there's networks, computer networks. There's also networks of genes and proteins. So network data, graph data is very, very common in a lot of domains. And so we have specific algorithms to handle network data and the dynamics that are happening in networks. Time series data is also a very special type of data because it tells us the dynamics of a system and how it is evolving. So time series can also contain errors. The sampling may be different. So you may collect readings every minute, every 10 minutes, every hour, every 10 hours. You may change the intervals at which you're collecting the data. If you collect them more often, your sensor may run out of batteries. There's lots of interesting problems in time series data that we also have developed algorithms for. And finally, simulation data is also very valuable to understand phenomena. I have an example here from how to understand the formation of valleys and river systems. And so in this case, we have a characterization of flat terrain at the beginning of time that's completely flat. There's some rock, there's some clay. It starts to rain. We can run different simulations with different intensity and disperse rain patterns, and then start to see where the water starts to accumulate and be absorbed, how the rivers start to form, and then in the end, there's some river system. If we run many simulations under many different rain conditions, it starts to show us patterns. So there's always going to be some river branch over here. This area depends on how much rain there will be. And so it helps us see different likelihood that patterns appear in these river systems. So we can simulate flights, airplanes, we can simulate populations, we can simulate a lot of different natural systems and build digital twins and run programs that let us see what happens in those kinds of systems through the simulations. Very useful to understand complex systems. So all of these different kinds of data, I've told you some aspects that make the data different from what we had 30, 20 years ago. The data is becoming different in nature, new data that we're collecting that is enabled by online platforms, by sensors. So the data, the science of data has become more and more prominent and more important. When we talk about data, it's also important to think not just about the type of data that we're collecting or the different types of data that we're collecting from the same system that give us different information, different perspectives, but also all the different tasks that are associated with having data that we can process. So at the top of this cycle is defining some questions, some reasons, and some goals for collecting the data. Maybe it's simply because we want to have the data and start to analyze it, to start noticing some initial patterns, and then more specific questions come later. So it can be exploratory questions. We collect data. Sometimes we find data online or from other sources that have collected it before. That can be very powerful, as we will discuss later. The data has to be stored somewhere. This is very important because you may not be able to keep all the data that you're able to collect. So you may have to do some selective storage. Finally, when you're ready to use the data, you may extract a subset. You may only want to look at a decade of data or maybe 3 decades of data. So you can start to extract from all the data that you have some specific slices or or subsets of the data. So you have to enable that kind of data extraction. The data might be pre-processed. So we mentioned earlier how it can have some errors, or maybe the time series data can have different samplings, or maybe you can take network data and say, you've never observed a connection between these two people, but you're going to add one because they live in the same address. So you take your raw data and you augment them with other kinds of information that you have. So pre-processing data can be very powerful, because the better quality your starting data, the better your analysis and your results will be. Then you can design an analysis. You can come up with a method and an approach that will work. You can run all of that software. You can check the results. And when you're happy, you may iterate and collect more data, or find other data, or run a different analysis. But when you're happy with your results, you want to present them, maybe to decision makers, maybe to someone that will care about the answers that you're finding. Maybe a scientist will publish a paper. Maybe a company will include their results in an annual report. But however the way, you have to select and figure out a way to present the findings in a compelling way. And that may lead to the next round of questions. So this entire data lifecycle is a very important component of data science. There's many different aspects that you have to take into account if you have data science capabilities in an organization. A good question that many people ask is data science versus computer science. So are they the same thing, overlapping, different? So there is a lot of overlap. There's been research in computer science for many years on databases, data integration, scalable data systems, and also high performance computing. There's many aspects in computer science that overlap, and we build on that in data science. But data science goes beyond computer science. We worry about understanding a domain properly and the questions that are asked in that domain, and the data that is to be collected. Those kinds of questions are not necessarily studied in computer science. We worry about the ethical uses of data and how we approach the collection of data. We think about different techniques to do data acquisition and how to design them. We think about integrating and wrangling different kinds of data that may have different quality. We think about data provenance so that we understand where the data come from and what is the correct and proper way to use it. And there's also a lot of ways to study the value of data. So I think there's a lot of these aspects in data that are really proper data science problems, and not so much computer science problems, generally speaking. There's also a good question about how data science may be different or overlap with artificial intelligence. So, of course, there's a great amount of overlap. So in artificial intelligence or signal processing, there's a lot of algorithms to find patterns in data, and to learn new things from data, and to learn to predict things from the data. There's also a lot of useful work on extracting information, integrating information, natural language processing to extract information from text. So a lot of different areas in this respect. Scalable inference, reasoning with data, particularly in graphs and networks. And finally, intelligent user interfaces to present results and to interact with the data. But data science really goes beyond AI, and I gave a number of areas that are covered in data science that are not covered in AI. So there's a lot of overlap, but they're different. And this Venn diagram tries to get to that. So there's a lot of areas and topics in data science that overlap with AI, with machine learning, with different areas in computer science, statistics, mathematics, security, privacy. There's many intersections, but there's also areas that are specific to data science that are more emphasized in data science on themselves. You see at the bottom that there's also an overlap with different disciplines. And what that means to indicate is that every discipline has a lot of quantitative methods, and those are very valuable for data science, and they become front and center in a way to enrich them with machine learning techniques or data science approaches, and a way to understand how the questions in those domains and the methods in those domains can be joined with data science techniques. So this is hopefully helping see all of the touching points. So we covered what is data science, and I hope that you understand better what we mean by data science and the kinds of areas that are emphasized in data science, and that there's no clear and severe boundaries between those disciplines. It's a difference in emphasis. What I'd like to do now is talk about privacy and sensitive data. This is very important in data science, and possibly a topic that is so important to all of us in our personal lives that I would like to cover it and help you understand more about how privacy protects or doesn't protect us. So in a technical sense, we talk about privacy in terms of sensitive data. So sensitive data is data that is about individuals or organizations that we don't want to be freely disseminated or publicized. So for example, data about how individuals are learning, the grades that they're getting, the topics that they're maybe more skillful at, et cetera, et cetera. Or maybe health data, our diagnosis or particular aspects of our health. Privacy refers to the desire to limit the dissemination of sensitive data. So of course, education data, we want the teachers to see so that they can improve education, but we may not want policymakers or city managers, legislators to get a hold of data about individuals, maybe only aggregate data about how the education results are, but not about individuals. So privacy refers to limiting the dissemination of that sensitive data in some way. When we talk about sensitive data, it's very important to realize two things. One is that there's data that is sensitive, some sensitive characteristic or sensitive attribute. So in this example, it's the health problem that the individual has that they may not want to be a public information. On the other hand, there may be data that's not very sensitive. So the race, the birth date, the gender, the zip code, you can tell my gender most likely just from looking at me. And so identifying values are those values that can lead you to identify an individual. So if I know where somebody lives and their zip code, I may be able to identify what problem they have if they're the only person that have that problem. So there's this notion of identifying values and the sensitive attributes, and they're both things to be protected. So there's a lot of techniques that are called anonymization, and we all hear that our sensitive data or to protect our privacy, our data are being anonymized. So many times our name will be omitted, will be dropped from our record, maybe our birth date. So sometimes these identifying values are removed. Other times, these identifying values are replaced by randomly generated identifiers. So we may be given a random name instead of our actual name. Sometimes there's abstractions that really help protect our identity. So for example, rather than the date that we check to a hospital, it may have a semester or a month. Or our zip code may be replaced with the state where we live. And so that can help protect and anonymize our data. And then finally, maybe cluster individuals into groups. And so say the grades in this school fall under these clusters. So that can help protect individuals. There's two problems with this. One is that sometimes the data is not specific enough for the research that we want to do or for the data science analysis that we want to do. So for example, if we replace the zip code by the state, we may not be able to tell the difference between someone who lives in a city and has respiratory problems because of pollution in that city, someone that lives in the countryside that may not have those problems. So it may be too coarse for research to just have the state instead of the zip code. There's another major problem, which is re-identification, which is that you released a random identifier instead of my name, but somehow somebody can reconstruct what my name is, and we'll see some examples next. So one example of this is when people post opinions online. So sometimes we post anonymized data about reviews. We may post a review of a teacher or a doctor, but we don't want the doctor to know who we are. So we post these anonymized reviews. We may use a fake name. There was a study that showed that it only takes one public expression of your identity to be able to put together your name again from cross linking sources. So it just takes one source that has your actual identity, and then it's possible to link across sources, in this example through the date of the review or the topic of the review. Another example that's a bit more complex than that is that our behavior patterns lead to identifying us. So one of the interesting things is if you say, you know, I'm anonymous, you don't have my name, but you leave a trail of where you have been, where you have checked in and used your credit card at, and so on and so forth. There's public records that can be linked together, records from your credit card company. And so you may not have your name attached to your geolocation in your phone for some apps, but they can buy records that give them an idea of your actual name. So behavior patterns and behaviors can be easily reconstructed. Finally, and this is a very significant one, if you have birth date, sex, and zip code, you can re-identify and de-identify 87% of the population. So even if the data set is anonymized, you can reconstruct who the person is. So on the lower left is LaTanya Sweeney. She's a professor at Harvard. She's my hero because she really showed that this was the case. She took the data from the voters list and was able to identify that the governor of the state of Massachusetts had been in the hospital, and actually identify all the way up to you know, the reason why he was in the hospital, what he was treated for, which was not publicly known. And so this was very significant research. And one of the things that this led to is for LaTanya to propose a concept of K-anonymity that I will describe next. The idea here is that if you have at least K individuals that have the same identifying values, then no one will be able to tell you apart. The problem with that governor of Massachusetts is that he was the only one with that zip code that could have checked into that hospital. So the name was in the voter's record, so he could be re-identified. So the K in that example was 1. In this example, there's a few records, at least 2 records that have the same zip code or that have the same identifying values. So the idea of K-anonymity is that if no one can tell the difference between K people, then it could be any of the K people. So if you want to have a data set with a K-anonymity of 50, that's better than a data set that has a K-anonymity of 1. in terms of protecting privacy. This has been a really, really important concept in protecting privacy ever since. A related and very interesting concept is the idea of L diversity. So a data set has L diversity if the individuals that share the same identifying values have at least L different values for the sensitive attribute. So in this case, you can see that L is actually 1. And so if you can identify who belongs in a certain category because of their identifying values, then you can see that they have the sensitive attribute that is associated with it. So it doesn't matter that you cannot tell which is it T3 or T4. In fact, whether you are T3 or T4, you have hypertension. So your protected sensitive attribute is no longer private. So the higher the L diversity, the more protected the individuals are. And for some data sets, it's very hard to have L diversity, but it's a very, very important concept in terms of understanding whether privacy is protected for the individuals. So here I want to show examples of how privacy policies can be stated and protected. For example, there may be data collected at clinic 1, location 1, shown on in the middle of the screen. And then clinic 2 in location 2 has a different data set. And so the idea would be that the privacy policies may say that the data cannot be moved to another location until they undergo abstraction, they undergo k-anonymity, until they are encrypted, and then at some point they're moved to location 5 to actually do the analysis together. So these are very important concepts to express policies in terms of privacy. I want to share some recent ideas. One is the idea of federated learning, where the data never leaves the individual organization. So in this case, it's health data that is kept at different hospitals and organizations. The data stays there, and there's a common joint federated server that will keep track of what is learned from the data in each organization. So each organization has a local model of how the patients are doing and the patterns there, and then those local models are sent to the federated server to build a global model. This is very challenging, but it ensures that the data never leaves the original hospital, and it's protected in a lot of ways. So it's a great approach to preserving privacy. That said, there's a lot of people that believe that there is zero privacy anyway. Your data is going to leak. There's going to be some way or another that the data is going to get out there, that your personal information is already owned by companies, etc. In the health arena, there's a lot of nonprofits that are encouraging people to share their health data in ways that allow researchers to use that data. So if you go through a rare disease, or if you have cancer and you want to help other patients, you may donate your data to these nonprofits to enable them to do research properly. And they can pull data from many people and be able to make more progress in the research. So, so there's this concept of actually donating your own personal data. I want to cover briefly 2 topics on protecting privacy that you may hear about in the future. One is the concept of a data pod. So you collect data about your health, your musical preferences, your work, your schedule, your photos, anything. And you store that data not in the cloud, but in a local server, in your local computer. You own that data and you store that data. Now you have people that you trust personally, and so you may allow them to take your data and store that data in their computer. And through these networks of people that you know and that you trust, you may be able to have replicas of your data, so that if your computer goes down or is burned or you lose it, your data has copies elsewhere. And through these networks, you may get requests to enable certain uses of your data. So people may need images to study something, or they may want to look at calendars to be able to schedule something. So you give permission for people to access your data in a very specific way. So this concept is proposed by Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the web. And it's a really interesting and intriguing way to have very distributed data. Another concept that's very powerful is the idea of data trusts. So when a hospital releases your data, or a company has a data breach and your privacy is compromised, then you have no recourse as an individual. And so what a data trust does is that you put your data in a trust with many other users. And that data trust is a legal entity that can sue a company for being neglectful with your sensitive data. So in this diagram, there's an example of a data trust in the center, where people that ride bikes decide to donate their data to this data trust. And the data trust may make agreements with the city in terms of where are the popular spots where people ride more bikes. So they may put some facilities there. They may get money from companies that want to look at bike sharing and ride sharing, and be able to take advantage of that data. So they would pay data to the trust and eventually to the individuals. And as I said, your sensitive data is protected because it's a legal entity that's protecting your data. So these are data pods and data trusts, very recent concepts, but very important for privacy. Finally, we leave privacy and trust behind to move into a very important aspect of data science, which is transparency and reproducibility. And this will be our last topic today. So why do we need transparency? Because anytime that we handle data and we analyze data, if we only look at the results, we may not realize and be aware that there's a certain bias in the way that the data was used or processed in any way. So in this slide, I'm showing a diversity of sources of bias that we may want to be aware of. And so the more transparency there is about how the data was handled, the more we may be able to examine or realize or look at potential biases. So in the data sources, there may be sources that a city offers or a research university offers. In those data sources, there may be some historical biases because some prejudices may have distorted the way that populations are described or groups are described. There may be behavioral biases. So maybe surveys were collected from people and people may have not reported certain things. For example, it's well known that people are more likely to report positive experiences than negative experiences. When you collect data, there's a lot of sources of biases as well. So for example, how you are sampling the data, how you retrieve data from a data source. You may take, a 1% of the data, and how you do that, you select that 1% may be biased. Also, you may filter the data. So you may decide to pick certain populations that may not be very representative of everything. So that might also lead to biases in your results. Once you have the data, you prepare the data, and that also has certain sources of bias. For example, you may normalize your data. You may use a standard way to represent the data that may not be good for some populations. You may drop data that has missing values or outliers that are out of range that may make you miss out on populations that are important, etc. You may also summarize the data or make abstractions that may lose information and introduce problems in your analysis. When you're analyzing the data, you may have model bias. So the choice of model that you have, the choice of the way that you are extracting patterns from data or doing learning determines what patterns you actually learn or what functions you actually learn. Also, the methodology may lead to biases. For example, you have to test on unseen data that is separate from training data. And when that is not done, that may introduce problems. And finally, in the evaluation of the data, there's also biases in the way that one presents the results, in the way that you are trying to satisfy many metrics and measures that cannot be satisfied simultaneously. And so you may favor one versus another. And also the persons preparing these reports may have some personal blind spots that lead to biases as well. So all of these reasons lead to understanding that the more that we are transparent about how we approach the problem and what we did will help others understand how to qualify our results and how to put our results in perspective. Another reason for needing transparency is not because there may be biases in the process, but because there may be omissions or imperfect reporting. So in science, there's a lot of publications that for lack of space or for not wanting to include too much tedious detail, it makes it hard for others to reproduce what was done, to get similar results. And so there's many examples in science of others having problems reproducing results. The worst case of this is when there's actually errors in the analysis. So an example of this was in a study that two economists at Harvard did and was published, and they made some recommendations with respect to different countries and their financial state. And there was a student that wanted to reproduce these results and could not. And so in the end, the original authors gave the students their data in the form of a spreadsheet, and the student realized that there was a lot of missing data that was not used for some of the countries. And so this led to, the results were still standing, but there was a lot of controversy in terms of, well, how much of the things that we are looking at in terms of data are actually correct and how many errors we have. So since as humans, we make errors, we make mistakes, it's useful to always make our data public, make our analysis as transparent as possible. And there's a video of Stephen Colbert really reflecting on this human error in science, if you're interested in seeing that. So one of the things that I want to make you aware of is different ways in which we can make data analysis transparent. And in this case, I'm going to draw from principles of how to publish scientific papers that are more transparent. But of course, this applies to any kind of work. And they are, in fact, aspects that have to do with really including software, including data when you are describing an analysis, but also making the research reproducible. What does that take? Practicing open science, and then also adopting digital scholarship practices. So You can see a lot more detail in the links that I give you there. Something that we talk about a lot is using fair data principles to make the data really findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. You can find out a lot more about this in those links, but let me give you some ideas. So to make your research reproducible by somebody else, you want to make sure that you release the data sets that you used, the software or the models that you use to get your results, but also all the steps, all the data pre-processing, the entire workflow of steps that you followed with as much detail as possible in terms of parameter values, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing is to release your experimental design. So what hypotheses did you have? Did you have a hypothesis that you had posed beforehand, or did you come up with a hypothesis after playing with the data for a long time? Because then your hypothesis may be biased. You want to come clean about that. You may also want to release how you decided to prepare the test data, how did you identify the test data, and a number of other pieces of the methodology that you followed in doing your experiments. The second set of principles come from practicing open science. I mentioned the FAIR principles before. So one thing is to put your data in shared repositories where people are going to find it. If I put my data in my website or in a personal space, people would not think of looking there. The data should have a license to tell people what they are able to do with the data. So it's possible to restrict data to say, you cannot change the data. You can only do certain things with it. You cannot edit my images, for example, or you can if I give you permission through my license. And then to add a lot of metadata. Metadata can be about how the data was collected or describe the contents or some statistical characteristics. So metadata is very important to be able for others to be able to understand what the data is about. I want to spend a second on data licenses. A very common set of data licenses are offered by Creative Commons. One very common one is called CC-BY, the Creative Commons BY license, that basically says that anyone can do anything with your data as long as they give you credit, and you can specify how you want the credit to be happening. And then CC0, the Creative Commons 0 license, says that you don't reserve any rights. You don't want anybody to credit you with this. So it could be a picture that you take that you want to be credited for, or maybe you don't want any credit for it. Same thing applies to any kind of data. So that's on the open research. And then finally, on digital scholarship, you want your data sets to have unique identifiers. URLs may be lost after a bit of time. They may change. They may be moved somewhere else. So they have to be persistent. So these are PEARLs or DOIs, if you have a DOI authority that gives you DOIs. So everything can be assigned one of these unique identifiers that will stay there forever. And there's studies that show that almost 70% of the URLs that are included in documents are dead after 6 months or so. They no longer resolve to the website, the original website. So that's concerning, of course. And then finally, it allows authors to actually cite the sources of the data and give credit to the authors for the data that they provided. In this sense, I want to mention that there's lots and lots of open data repositories available. So if you are working on a problem, if you're interested on a topic, whether it is environmental or health or education or government or policy, you may find very, very useful data out there. And so You can search the web, but you can also go to specific open data repositories. So there's a list there of many of these repositories. Some of them are curated in the sense that, just like a museum, they have people that look at the data sets very carefully and annotate what they are about, and they double check that they are properly included in the repository. Other times, the repositories are not curated. You can upload anything that you would like. These repositories contain a lot of information that is free. You don't have to pay any money to put your data there, and so they're very, very helpful. And finally, there's also data aggregators that search through data sets. So Google Dataset Search is one such example. It searches on the web for data sets that have what's called schema.org annotations in the data sets. And there's also Wikidata. Wikidata contains a lot of data. Specifically, specific examples are data about proteins, locations, all kinds of publications and other information. So, they have ways to query data sets that are very effective. So something very nice to do is to think of a problem that you're interested in, or your particular area or domain of interest, and search for data and be surprised about the data that is available, and check the licenses and the availability to you to access that data, and have fun. Sometimes you can merge data from different sources and you end up with a very powerful insight on some phenomena or behavior or scientific question. So have fun with data, and keep studying, keep learning about what data has to offer and how it can help with your research, your problems, your interests, and your career looking forward. I'll see you next time.